every weekend on Book TV.
Jessica Mitford was a journalist and author of 9 books, including The American Way of Death, The American Way of Birth, and Poison Penmanship, The Gentle Art of Muckraking. Ms. Mitford died in 1996 after she revised The American Way of Death to propose legislation intended to reform the funeral industry. Her husband, Robert Truhaft, and some of her friends gathered at Cody's bookstore in Berkeley, California to pay tribute to her and her last book.
Okay. Good evening. Thank you very much for coming to Cody's. We're very excited to have this all-star lineup to talk about and read from Jessica Mitford's The American Way of Death Revisited. We've got a bang-up lineup tonight, and we have C-SPAN here filming, so we want to get right on it. Our first person to speak is Jessica Mitford's husband, Mr. Bob Truhaft. And he's going to come up and be our master of ceremonies. And then we'll also be hearing from Karen Leonard, Leah Garchik, Doug Foster, Christopher Hitchens, and with a surprise musical conclusion. So please welcome Mr. Bob Truhaft, and we'll get going. Thank you very much.
Welcome, friends. With this all-star group of speakers, I'm going to keep my remarks to a minimum. As a matter of fact, I won't make any. I'm going to read something to you. I'm very grateful to Bob Gottlieb, who saw this thing through. While Decca was alive, he was our constant advisor, and after her death, he was my constant advisor also. When I started work on the book after Decca's death, I looked through all the material she had there, and I found a couple of dozen letters from Decca to Bob Gottlieb. I didn't find one from him to her, and she was asking technical questions. So I called him, and I said, Bob, look, you'll be my editor for this book, won't you, just as you were for Decca? He said, of course, I will be. I said, well, I found all these letters from Decca to you, not one from you to Decca. What happened? Where are they? He said, well, I so enjoyed Decca's letters and was so amused by them, I just call her up. And we have long chats on the telephone. So I said, well, my letters won't be that amusing. You'll have to write to me. He promised he would. He wrote once. But what he wrote was very good. And I was so glad that he took from me the burden of writing this little note to explain the history of the book. At a happy lunch with me in 1995, Jessica Mitford, Decca to everyone who knew her, agreed to prepare an updated version of her classic work, The American Way of Death. As she reports in her introduction to this volume, we had worked on that book together in the early 60s and had remained close friends both through a number of other publishing ventures and after our professional relationship came to an end. A lot had changed in the funeral trade since the first edition was published in 1963, and not many of the changes were for the better. The plan was to retain from the original everything that still applied and to add new chapters as needed, such as the report on the Tiburon Conference, called Not Selling, an investigation of the new international funeral giants, a global village of the dead, and an account of the failures of the Federal Trade Commission in the wake of the new legislation that was written largely in reaction to the first edition of the book. Certain material, for example, most of the chapter on floral tributes, the menace of P.O., please omit, was excised as no longer relevant although I suspect that the floral deluge that followed Princess Diana's death would have evoked some new commentary on this subject. And of course, a great deal of updating, particularly of prices, was needed. Most of this work, including the new chapters mentioned above, as well as the introduction and the final chapter, New Hope for the Dead, Decca finished before her unexpected and mercifully swift death from cancer in 1996. What remained to be done was accomplished by three people. First, there was a brilliant research and investigative assistant, Karen Leonard, who took on increasing responsibilities and indeed soon found herself drawn into the funeral reform movement. The second crucial person was Lisa Carlson, probably the most influential figure in that movement, who made many generous contributions to the book. Not least of all was her extensive help with the penultimate chapter. I'd never write that. Pay Now, Die Poor, which sets out the complex realities and booby traps inherent in pay-in-advance funerals. Finally, Decca's husband, Robert Truhav, had made her a promise just before she died. The distinguished labor, see, I couldn't write that, and civil rights lawyer who had worked with her on many of her books would retire from his practice and see this book through to completion. This he heroically did. Almost to her final week, Decca was reveling in the job, bombarding me and other pals with faxes that gleefully skewered the more fatuous and or hypocritical hijinks of the industry. She could be ruthless, savage even, when she was on the warpath, but she never stopped laughing, which is perhaps why the American Way of Death was not only welcomed as a necessary corrective in 1963, but was so enjoyed as a piece of writing, and why it still reads so well today. The American Way of Death Revisited is being published exactly 35 years after the original edition. Unfortunately, this corrective is necessary, is as necessary today as it was then. Fortunately, it is being applied. Robert Gottlieb.
I'm that brilliant researcher, Karen Leonard. But the truth is, the most brilliant thing I ever did was to go to work for Jessica Mitford. And I'd just come back from a tour in New York and Washington, doing a lot of reviews for the book. And it was so much fun because occasionally I would come across somebody who really knew her as Queen of the Muckrakers. And they would always ask me the same question, which was, what was she really like? You got to hang out with her. What was that like? And it was so exciting, and it was always a surprise. So I want to read a little bit to you from her first chapter, which is about the event I attended with her when she went to the funeral director's meeting. And she was invited to go to the special event in Tiburon. It's called, appropriately, Not Selling. When funeral directors have taxed me, which they have, and not infrequently, with being beastly about them in my book, I can affirm in good conscience that there is hardly an unkind word about them. In fact, the book is almost entirely given over to expounding their point of view. It is chock-a-block with their wise sayings, observations, exhortations, and philosophical reflections culled from funeral trade magazines and interviews with individual funeral directors and official spokesmen. I did mention that, like every other successful salesman, the funeral salesman must first and foremost believe in himself and his product, and that they long to be worthy of high regard, to be liked and understood, a most human longing. Merchants of a rather grubby order, preying on the grief, remorse, and guilt of survivors, or trained professional men with high standards of ethical conduct, the funeral men really would rather prefer to fit the latter category. To what extent, if any, has their outlook changed over the decades? I had a rare opportunity to observe a representative cross-section of the industry in action when, to my astonished delight, I was invited by Ron Hast, editor of Mortuary Management to be a featured speaker at a 2-day funeral service seminar to take place in October 1995 in Tiburon, California. That's like Ralph Nader being invited to address General Motors, a friend said. For me, the anticipation was akin to that felt like a 5-year-old promised a trip to Disneyland, or a teenager offered a big part in Hollywood movie. The reality did not disappoint. Tiburon is in Marin County, which, aside from being one of the richest communities in the country, has a cremation rate of about 3 times that of the national average, and thereby hangs a tale for while the seminar topics could have fit handily into any trade meeting agenda, maintaining an effective workforce, responding to community trends, better public relations, etc. The subtext of many a speech was how to extract maximum profit from cremation. We gathered in the Tiburon Lodge meeting hall overlooking a huge swimming pool, a congenial waspish kind of crowd consisting of 44 funeral directors from around the country, 5 presidents of casket companies, a few insurance men, and the president of DNR Airbrush Systems, and various spouses. Welcoming the group, our host, Ron Hast, glumly mentioned that there had been plenty of protest about my presence at the seminar, not the least of which was a State Funeral Directors Association's executive's dire threat to have his members cancel their subscriptions to mortuary management. The audience was soon put at ease by the first speaker, perhaps appropriately from the world of big business, John Baker, spry young former manager of a United Airlines subsidy with a staff of 1,000, responsible for all employee programs. His subject, how to maintain an effective workforce, which he attacked con brio with much folksy banter and down-home humor. His first question to the audience established the tone. Who's minding the store while you're away? Someone answered, my wife. Are you sure you can trust her? Gales of laughter. And be sure to chit-chat with your customers. But our customers don't talk, the casket salesman said. I'm going to stop right there because this is where I want to tell you what really happened underneath that. As we were sitting there scribbling notes, listening to this man talk about giving dinosaurs to your employees or balloons to them, etc., and he's going all these samples that he could do. And he says to the audience, let them use your condos over the weekend. And suddenly, Decca bolts upright, and she looks at me, and she scribbles furiously. Later that evening, we trade notes back and forth, and I had to be the bearer of bad news to tell her, no, he didn't say, let them use your condoms over the weekend. She says, oh my hearing is going. Later that evening, we go out to dinner, and we're followed, hounded by funeral directors. And we're in the restaurant, and they're all politely sitting at tables, waiting for us, for her to get finished. And so she finishes dinner, and she rises from the table. And suddenly, a man who I'm trying to give you the type he is, I always call them no necks. These are these guys that just don't seem to have a neck. And from the South, and he was this big, jolly guy, and he comes up, he oozes up to Decca, and he clasps her hand in his, both his fat, chubby little hands, and he looks at her and he says, I just want you to know that I paid $4,000 and traveled all these miles just to be with you today. And she says, goodness, you shouldn't have done that. You should have given me the $4,000. I'd have flown out to see you. And that was what traveling with Decca was like. You never knew what was going to come out of her mouth, and it was always a surprise and always a circus. So I want to thank you for being here tonight and want to welcome the next speaker and giving you more insights into Decca in this wonderful book, The American Way of Death Revisited.
Hi, I'm Leah Garchick, and I was a friend of Decca's. And I feel really lucky because I was kind of hoggish and grabbed the part I really thought was most delicious to read, what Decca would have called the killing part. Actually, it's post-killing because it's about embalming. But more than anything, I think I remember her voice and the way she'd stress things like that, the killing part and do tell. So I listen to Decca all the time. Anyway, this is a model for an embalmed, a to-be embalmed being, okay? The preparation room in any of the better funeral establishments has the tiled and sterile look of a surgery, And indeed, the embalmer, restorative artist who does his chores there, is beginning to adopt the word dermasurgeon, appropriately corrupted by some mortician writers as demi-surgeon, to describe his calling. His equipment, consisting of scalpels, scissors, augers, forceps, clamps, needles, pumps, tubes, bowls, and basins, is crudely imitative of the surgeon's, as is his technique, acquired in a 9 or 10-month post-high school course at an embalming school. He is supplied by an advanced chemical industry with a bewildering array of fluids, sprays, pastes, oil, powders, creams, to fix or soften tissue, shrink or distend it as needed, dry it here, restore the moisture there. There are cosmetics, waxes, and paints to fill and cover features, even plaster of Paris to replace entire limbs. There are ingenious aids to prop and stabilize the cadaver, a veripose headrest, the Edwards arm and hand positioner, the repose block to support the shoulders during the embalming, and the through foot positioner, which resembles an old-fashioned stocks. Mr. John H. Eccles, president of the Eccles School of Mortuary, thus describes the first part of the embalming procedure. In the hands of the skilled practitioner, this work may be done in a comparative short time and without mutilating the body other than by slight incision, so slight that it scarcely would cause serious inconvenience if made upon a living person. Lovely. It's necessary to remove the blood, and doing this not only helps in the disinfecting, but removes the principal cause of disfigurements due to discoloration. So we wring it out. Okay. The blood is drained out through the veins and replaced by embalming fluid pumped in through the arteries, as noted in the Principles and Practices of Embalming. Every operator has a favorite injection and drainage point, a fact which becomes a handicap only if he fails and refuses to forsake his favorites when conditions demand it. Typical favorites, I wish I knew medical terms so I knew where these arteries are the carotid artery, femoral artery, I know that somewhere here, jugular vein, and subclavian vein. We'll just guess. There are various choices of embalming fluid. If Flextone is used, it will produce a mild, flexible rigidity. The skin retains a velvety softness. The tissues are rubbery and pliable, ideal for women and children. It may be blended with B&G Products Company's lifelike tint, which is guaranteed to reproduce nature's own skin texture, the velvety appearance of living tissue. Suntone comes in 3 separate tints: suntan, special cosmetic tint, moderately pink. About 3 to 6 gallons of a dyed and perfumed solution of formaldehyde, glycerin, borax, phenol, alcohol, and water is soon circulating through Mr. Jones, whose mouth has been sewn together with a needle directed upward between the upper lip and gum and brought out through the left nostril, with the corners raised slightly for a more pleasant expression. If he should be buck-toothed, his teeth are cleaned with banane and coated with colorless nail polish. His eyes, meanwhile, are closed with flesh-tinted eye caps and eye cement. The next step is to have at Mr. Jones with a thing called a trocar. This is a long, hollow needle attached to a tube. It's jabbed in the abdomen and poked around the entrails and chest cavity, the contents of which are pumped out and replaced with cavity fluid. This done, and the hole in the abdomen having been sewn up, Mr. Jones' face is heavily creamed to protect the skin from burns caused by leakage of other chemicals, and he's covered with a sheet and left unmolested for a while, but not for long. There's more in store for him. He's been embalmed but not yet restored, and the best time to start the restorative work is 8 to 10 hours after embalming, when the tissues have become firm and dry. The object of all this attention to the corpse, it must be remembered, is to make it presentable for viewing in an attitude of healthy repose. The embalmer, having allowed an appropriate interval to elapse, returns to the attack and now brings into play the skill and equipment of sculptor and cosmetician. Is a hand missing? Casting one in plaster of Paris is a simple matter. For replacement purposes, only a cast of the back of the hand is necessary. This is within the ability of the average operator and is quite adequate. It's not going to play the piano in the casket, so you just have to do what shows. If a lip or two, a nose, or an ear should be missing, the embalmer has at his hand a variety of restorative waxes with which to model replacements. Pores and skin texture are simulated by stippling with a little brush, and over this cosmetics are laid on. Head off? Decapitation cases are rather routinely handled. Ragged edges are trimmed and head joined to torso with a series of splints, wires, and sutures. It's a good idea to have a little something at the neck, a scarf or hard collar, when time for viewing comes. Swollen mouth, cut out tissue is needed from inside the lips. If too much is removed, the surface contour can easily be restored by padding with cotton. Swollen neck and cheeks are reduced by removing tissue through vertical incisions made down each side of the neck. The opposite condition is more likely to present itself, that of emaciation. His hypodermic syringe now loaded with massage cream, the embalmer seeks out and fills the hollowed and sunken areas by injection. In this procedure, the backs of the hands and fingers and the underchin area should not be neglected. Positioning the lips is a problem that recurrently challenges the ingenuity of the embalmer. Closed too tightly, they tend to give a stern and disapproving expression. Ideally, embalmers feel the lip should give the impression of being ever so slightly parted, the upper lip protruding slightly for a more youthful appearance. This takes some engineering, however, as the lips tend to drift apart. Lip drift can sometimes be remedied by pushing 1 or 2 straight pins through the inner margin of the lower lip and then inserting them between the 2 upper front teeth. If Mr. Jones happens to have no teeth, the pins can just as easily be anchored in his Armstrong face former and dental replacer. Another method to maintain lip closure is to dislocate the lower jaw, which is then held in its new position by wire run-through holes drilled through the upper and lower jaws at the midline. There's a sentence here that uses a French phrase. I'm not going to even try it. If Mr. Jones has died of jaundice, the embalming fluid will very likely turn green. Does this deter the embalmer? Not if he has intestinal fortitude. Masking paste and cosmetics are heavily laid on. Burial garments and casket interiors are color correlated with particular care, and Jones is displayed between rose-colored lights. Friends will say, how well he looks. Death by carbon monoxide, on the other hand, can be a rather good thing from the embalmer's viewpoint. One advantage is this fact that this type of discoloration is an exaggerated form of natural pink coloration. This is nice because the healthy glow is already present and needs but little attention. The patching and filling completed, Mr. Jones is now shaved, washed, and dressed. A cream-based cosmetic available in pink, flesh, suntan, brunette, and blonde is applied to his hands and face. His hair is shampooed and combed, his hands manicured. For the horny-handed son of toil, special care must be taken. Cream should be applied to remove ingrained grime and the nails clean. If he were not in the habit of having them manicured in life, trimming and shaping is advised for better appearance, never questioned by kin. Thank you.
I'm Doug Foster, and I want to read a little bit from the end of the book, or the part of the book that represents some of the additional work that Decca did with Karen and Lisa's help, and then with Bob's help after she died, in putting this great book together. There was a really lousy review in the Chronicle, a book review, that said there isn't much new material here, and that's just not true. The guy couldn't have looked very carefully at the afterwards. A not unimportant point. I want to set this up just by saying that Decca was an amazing force of nature, and one of the things that friends of hers liked to do was to matchmake, because it was always interesting to see what she would do with somebody else who might be somewhere near a match for her. And when I heard that Karen and Decca's research had led to Service Corporation International, which is the conglomerate that does many, many funerals around the world, that she would be going to Texas, I said, you have to go and see Molly Ivins. The two of you together against the funeral directors. That was a match made in heaven from my point of view. And I've heard Molly tell the story of their visit. Molly's idea was, in addition to going to the corporate headquarters, they had to go together to the Mortuary Museum in Houston. That was a trip that absolutely had to be on the docket. So they went together. There's a huge museum dedicated to the mortuary arts in Houston. It takes up an entire block, and it has the various exhibits, history, the anthropology, the economics, the sociology of mortuary arts are all there. So if you can picture Decca and Molly together, that's enough for starters. But walking in to the Museum of Mortuary Arts and stopping at the first exhibit, big, large sign that says embalming. And Decca thought that might be a good place to start, so they sat down, and there was a film you could push a button to listen to, and the announcer said, the art of embalming was first invented by the Egyptians. At which point Decca leaned over to Molly and said, now there was a society where the funeral directors really completely got out of hand. This comes from the chapter called A Global Village of the Dead, and focuses on the way in which SCI, Service Corporation International, a great name for a company, has rationalized funerals, the modern funeral. J.P. Morgan in February 1996 carries an optimistic headline, Service Corporation International, a strong 1995 and positioned for 1996. Here also, the continued softness in the death rate is perceived as a bit of a problem. Throughout 1995, the death rate in North America was lower than the historical trend. Case volume was down 3% year to year. But there was a silver lining. The J.P. Morgan Bulletin continues, with extremely cold weather in North America during the first 2 months of 1996, the first quarter death rate should be closer to the historical trend of approximately 8.8 deaths per thousand. It is our understanding that where extreme weather conditions have been experienced in Europe and North America, volume did, in fact, increase during the first 5 weeks of 1996, and Europe appears well on its way to meeting or exceeding its plan for the first quarter. The twin strategies that go far to account for SCI's phenomenal success, both concepts entirely new to the funeral industry, are clustering and anonymity. Of the 22,000 funeral homes in the United States, the vast majority are small operations doing somewhere between 50 and 100 funerals a year. Critics of the industry attribute high prices to this factor. They point out that the owner who performs 1 or 2 funerals a week must nevertheless maintain a full complement of embalmers, equipment, hearses, funeral cars, and sales personnel to serve these few customers. It's full-time pay for part-time work, as one analyst put it. SCI entered this picture with the force of a hurricane, swept away the antiquated methods of the old-timers and substituted clustering, the latest in streamlined mass production. Borrowing from the successful techniques of McDonald's, where food preparation and management functions are centralized, SCI first buys up a carefully chosen selection of funeral homes, cemeteries, flower shops, and crematoria in a given metropolitan area. The next step is to move the essential elements of the trade to a central depot. Clustered in this hive of activity are the hearses, limousines, utility cars, drivers, dispatchers, embalmers, and a spectrum of office workers, from accountants to data processors, who are kept constantly busy servicing at vast savings the needs of a half dozen or more erstwhile independent funeral homes. Needless to say, the savings obtained via the cluster approach are not passed on to the consumer. SCI prices have risen sharply with a targeted increase of 30%. In markets like Houston, where SCI with its 20 funeral and cemetery businesses has a predominant position, 75% of the market, its prices, according to a recent survey, average 60% higher than those of the independents in the area. In Washington, D.C., 40% higher. One of the advantages of this kind of clustering and rationalization of the industry is that you can write one script for every encounter that these various workers are going to have in a funeral home. And Decca and Karen got a hold of the SCI directive about how families are to be treated when they walk into any one of these homes, all of which have the name of the local proprietor, but in fact are run by SCI. So here's the script, which Decca likened to a TV miniseries script. As your arrangement comes to the casket selection stage, we would like you to use the following approach. This is written in the script. Mr. and Mrs. blank, I would now like to assist you in selecting a suitable coffin casket or casket for blank. Enter selection room and proceed to stand behind the Classic Royal in the middle of the room. Guide the family to stand in front of the Classic. I would like to introduce you to our Classic Royal. This design is that of a European contemporary coffin. It is elegant, finished in rose mahogany gloss with fine line gold engraving on the sides. This unit combines expert craftsmanship with a fully satin-lined interior. It is priced at $1,595. Now, move to your right and stand behind the Classic Royal. Here to the right, we have our most recent design, and we call this the Classic Royal. It combines the shape of both a coffin and a casket to give us the very popular whiter shape with a rose mahogany gloss finish. This item combines the versatility of Australian native timber and craftwork. It is priced at $1,995. Move to the white pearl on the stand to your left. This is our white pearl. It has been designed in the traditional coffin shape. The material from which it is made is craftwood. It is priced at $995. Now proceed to the Hanover in your right back corner and stand beside it. There follows a glowing description of the Hanover, which is priced at $2,995. Doe or counterpart then tells the family, I will be just over here. Move near to the top of the stairs if you have any questions. The final stage direction. Allow your family as much time as they need, but ensure that you do not leave them in the room. Read their body language. The casket prices quoted for Australia may be increased by a factor of 3 or more for the U.S. equivalent. Note, too, the use of the word coffin, a definite no-no in the lexicon of the American funeral trade. But down under, the word casket may mean, as elsewhere in the English-speaking world except for the United States, an ornate box for jewels or other valuables. Australians are just now being indoctrinated by SCI into its undertaker-bestowed meaning of burial receptacles. SCI has improved upon the somewhat primitive list of OK words in its recent manual for the use of its cemetery salespeople. A special terminology has been developed in keeping with the Memorial Park Plan. Just as well-designed tablets, flower gardens, and statuary of genuine merit have taken the place of bleak and often garish tombstones, so words that are pleasing in their suggestion of beauty and dignity are used in place of those that are harsh and linked with depressing ideas. Certain words and phrases long associated with cemeteries sometimes increase sales resistance because they suggest images of a negative, morbid, and depressing nature. The following is a list of positive action words and phrases in contrast to those that are negative. The latter should, as far as possible, be eliminated from all sales vocabulary. Herewith a partial list of SCI's deathless words. Casket coach, not hearse. Display area, not casket room. Interment space, not grave. Opening interment space, not digging grave. Closing interment space, not filling up grave. The grave digger has a problem. He may not fill the grave with dirt, he must fill it with earth. His task will be preceded not by a funeral, but by a memorial service. The decedent was not sick, he was ill, and he didn't die, he passed on. His remains were not embalmed, they were prepared. There were no mourners present for the service, only relatives and friends.
And of course, if that language of gruesome euphemism wasn't being used to turn a profit, it would be called political correctness and be denounced everywhere, up and down here. I don't know how many of you, comrades, friends, brothers and sisters, remember the Republican convention in Miami that nominated Richard Nixon to be president. I'm sure some of you do. But the scene was of the delegates sleeping up and down in unison holding a big sign which said, "Now more than ever." I used to watch it, I used to think, I know this is reminding me of something. Now more than ever, now more than ever. Actually, it was Renata Adler who's finally pointed out to me, it's the opening of one of the most beautiful stanzas of Keats's Ode to a Nightingale, which, as you may remember, says, "Now more than ever seems it rich to die." And the idea of these energized Republican bunnies doing this, all unaware, reminded me of one of my favorite sayings, which is that in the midst of life, we are in death. I never tire of saying that. And I think that the finest, as a result, stave of the book that we're met to, I would not like to say commemorate, to celebrate, which I read when it first came out and I reread and reviewed for Los Angeles Times earlier this year. I'm more than ever convinced that the greatest passage in it is its title. The genius of the thing lies in its name. Remember that in the 1950s and 1960s, one of the subliminal, perhaps the subliminal, the main subliminal keystone and key word of state authority and state propaganda and of the Cold War was the very phrase, "our way of life." It was in defense of the way of life that people were supposed to buy, again with high-pressure euphemistic salesmanship, fallout shelters and equip them with chemical toilets and enough drinking water for 3 days and a kitty litter box and all the other requisites for maintaining this way of life in the event of thermonuclear holocaust. It was in defense of the way of life that small children were bullied and blackmailed into doing duck and cover exercises in school and made to prepare for extinction at any moment under the supervision of the teachers who were supposed to be enlightening them in the liberal arts and broadening their tiny minds. Remember, in fact, it really should never be possible to forget that we live in a state or under a state that, in a manner not known since the late medieval period, claims as of right the right of life and death over all its citizens, and not over them alone, but over everyone else living on the planet. Claims the right to exterminate them en masse and to make preparations for this, and run and maintain them and test them hourly and use them at any time as a whim, if need be, in defense of a way of life. That is the permanent dictatorship that we live under. Everyone here in this room is, in fact, sitting here listening to me in a uniform, in a front line, and their lives can be taken at any time. That's what the defense of the way of life meant then, means now. It was never better summarized, that preparation, the preparation for that event, and the arming of the thermonuclear arsenal and the creation of an undemocratic and unelected nuclear state to back it up with every means of surveillance and intimidation, never better described than in one very beautiful phrase of the late Dr. Martin Luther King, who said that it was magnificent in its horror because it was the preparation to commit suicide and genocide at the same time. And not only, of course, for all of us and everyone else living on the planet, but everyone who's ever been born or died and been buried since recorded time began, because once there was no one to remember that anyone had ever been here, everyone would have been killed all over again. And Shakespeare would have been killed, and Goethe, and Schiller, and Milton, and the loss of Richard Nixon would, I think, have been a small consolation. Dr. King was very busy on other fronts at the time he made that speech. One of the extraordinary things about the positions he took about war and militarism was that he would have had every excuse to say, I'm heavily engaged on other fronts. Did indeed have that excuse. Was often told to stick to his business as a colored man and not involve himself in these more complex questions. But if you recall, there was a bit of a struggle in the states of the former Confederacy, and indeed in the buildings of the federal government and Congress, as to whether or not people with the wrong amount of melatonin in the skin were entitled to claim the right of American citizenship. And the Southern and former Confederate rhetoric against this, saying this should not happen and must not, the bar in the schoolhouse door against it, was in defense of the way of life. And of course, Mrs. Mitford Truehaft did her bit, plunging around in those states at a time when it was extremely dangerous to do so, driving around with petitions to try and save Willie McGee from being executed, because the way of life did mean that people had to be killed in its defense, and could be, and that those who killed them could not be punished or brought to book. So, by ridiculing and by deconstructing this key phrase, she did, I think, an enormous amount to unblock the mental and moral logjam of the time, as well as to draw attention to the obvious fact that exploitation by capital continues beyond the grave. It used to be said of people like the Salvation Army that they offered pie in the sky. It's supposed to be a criticism, but at least they were offering pie in the sky. It was said of others, well, you know, perhaps you can't take it with you. No, you can't take it with you, suddenly said the free enterprise system. We want, and you can't have it up there either, we want all the surplus value you've ever accumulated in this vale of tears before you go, and we want it now. And by confronting that, it seems to me again a tremendous cultural and political point was being made. And as a result, the book will be read as long as the ethos of capitalism remains sovereign, which means that it's got ahead of it a longer sail than I would otherwise like to have predicted. One can't have everything. Now, I was very much honored by Bob Truehuff when he asked me to speak at the Memorial for Decca, which took place in London. And after the memorial was over, I met someone I hadn't seen for a long time, who'd been sitting quietly in the front row, and we had a drink, Lady Mary Soames, who was born Mary Churchill, the eldest daughter of Winston Churchill. And she's called Soames because she's the widow of a fantastically unattractive, bloated conservative politician. And I was touched that she'd come, because there was obviously a kinship between the Churchill family and the Mitford family, and she told me the following story, which I'll see if I can relate pointfully, pungently. Trust me, bear with me. A thing you have to know for it to make sense is that it's one of the things, oddly enough, they don't teach you in school. At the beginning of the Second World War, the British establishment had to send quite a lot of its members overseas where they could do no harm, because it was thought if they were allowed to remain in the country, they would form a Quisling or Vichy government in the event of a Nazi invasion. They had to get rid of Edward VIII by making him governor of the Bahamas for that reason, the glamorous Prince of Wales, and his gorgeous wife. And they had to do that to Lord Halifax, the Neville Chamberlain's foreign secretary at Munich. The furthest they could think of sending him was to make him ambassador to Washington. That's where he was. You need to know this for the story to work. So Mary Soames told me this. He said, we were all frightfully worried about Decca, all of us girls. For one thing, we'd all been madly in love with Esmond, she said. But only Decca had the nerve to really go for him and elope with him. We were all frightfully worried. We were terribly upset when Esmond was killed, and we knew that Decca was all by herself in Washington. So when Daddy, that's Sir Winston Churchill, was setting off for his summit with Roosevelt, we all formed up on him and said, you can't come back from this summit unless you do something for Decca. So picture it. It's 1940. The Nazi empire, German imperialism has spread itself of almost the whole of the face of Europe. Churchill, in desperation, is going off to see the famed manager who holds the keys to the equally famed, no less famed, arsenal of democracy, and he can't come back unless he does something about Decca. And he's very worried about it. And he calls her in. He's in the White House, staying with Roosevelt. She comes in, recent widow, baby clamped on the hip, and says, you know, he's fine, look, frightfully sorry about Esmond and everything. And he also brought her the news that it was definite he'd been posted missing, but he wasn't coming back. They weren't going to find him. He'd been shot down over the North Sea. And said, look, but there's a silver lining. I've talked to our ambassador here, and he says that for a well-spoken and well-turned-out girl like you, there'd be a wonderful job. You could start tomorrow. Well-paid, house goes with it, lots of money. You just have to charm Americans, you know, be British and do all the things you do so well. He thought, you know, not bad. He'd taken time off from a crucial moment of his life to fix all this up. She got up off the bed where she'd been sitting. He said, if you imagine for 1 second that I would go and work for that filthy, Nazi-appeasing bastard, Lord Halifax, you have many, many more things coming, and swept out, okay? No job, recent widow, baby on the hip, take your job and shove it. Churchill flew back. They said, how did it go? He said, which, do you mean the Roosevelt bit or the Decca bit? the Decca bit, he said, it went very badly. It went very badly indeed. I tell this story partly because I know that it will make it seem for many people as if Decca's in the room when they hear the story. And then for another reason, which is that the ancients used to say that courage is not in itself one of the virtues. It isn't listed as one of the cardinal virtues on its own. However, it does squeeze in as the quality or faculty that makes all the other virtues possible. And I would be making a plus to saint of her if I was to go on about Decker's virtues, but here's the quality she had all the time was courage. And the courage to do what she did that day was just one example of it, and since it's one of the less well-known, I thought I'd introduce it. But the great test of courage is and always has been traditionally fortitude in the face, precisely in the face of death. That's when you find out whether you've got it or not. Not to say you're not afraid of it, but to overcome that fear. And it seems to me that Mrs. Mitford Truehaft acquitted herself very well by that definition. Not only was she against the exploitation of death by the, what I call in my review, the thanatocrats of the ghastly mausoleum and mortuary industry. Not only did she make their life, and continues to make it, shameful and something of a hissing and a byword wherever decent people are gathered together. She was also against all the false consolations that people offer for death, against the self-evident nonsense of religion, of belief in afterlife or reincarnation or any kind of superstition, always ridiculing it with a very mordant wit, and against the cult of death that sentimentalizes it and attempts to look away, to avert the gaze by various forms of denial. And then, of course, finally, when her own turn came, as she knew it would, faced it with exactly the combination of stoicism and humor and resolve and attention to comradeship that one would have predicted. So that, by my count, is about 4 victories over the great Reaper, and it enables us to say, in her memory and in her honor tonight, and with pride, death be not proud.
Jessica Mitford's last book, The American Way of Death Revisited, is published by Alfred Knopf, a division of Random House.